Hi folks, this is Eugene, and today I'm going to persuade you why you should believe in God using Bayesian games. So the central problem here is that we don't know whether God actually exists or not. That's the reason we have this dilemma. We don't know whether we want to be an atheist or a believer. And so we introduce the concept of Bayesian games. Bayesian games are a set of games that players have incomplete information. Each player in the game is associated with a set of types, and each type corresponds to a different payout function for that player. So Bayesian game, in essence, it captures the strategic decision process under the uncertainty of which you don't know what payoff are you receiving. And in fact, players don't actually always know what exact game are they playing. In terms of formal definition of Bayesian games, it is a tuple with the following variables. N equals to the different set of agents, the players of the game. A is essentially the available actions to that specific player. And theta would be the type space of player I. Type space is basically the subset, it's a different equivalence classes that models the all possible games that player I could have been playing. But then again, for player I, it is indistinguishable between these different type spaces. P would be the common prior over different types, which is the probability that a specific type is going to be played. And finally, the utility received by a player would be modeled by this utility function. Okay, let's now consider this specific problem. Should you believe in God? So here we have two players. We have God and we have human beings. God could either decide to punish or to not punish. And human beings could decide to either be a believer or an atheist. God prefers not to punish human beings, but God would be more painful if God punishes a believer compared to an atheist. So here are a set of instructions that we're going to consider during our modeling. And then the energy consumed to worship God is 1 unit, and the utility that God gains from receiving these worships would also be 1 unit. Human beings could gain 10 units if human enters heaven and lose 10 units if enters hell. And finally, God either exists or does not exist. So here we say that there's a probability P that exists and 1 minus P that it does not exist. So this is a binary situation. Now here, this model is exactly what we had just talked about. And the payoff within this model is corresponding to the previous instructions that we just mentioned. And notice that here at the normal form game, we have two equivalence classes, which human player is not able to distinguish. So human beings are here, and this is God. So when humans are making their strategic decisions of whether being a believer or an atheist, they have incomplete information in a sense that they don't know whether God actually exists or does not exist. Yet they have to somehow come up with a best response in order to maximize their utility. However, for player God, God has perfect information and God knows exactly whether God actually exists or not. And so we can look at some specific boxes to see the logic of this game. For example, if human decided to believe and God decided not to punish, you see that human would receive a payoff of 9. And this corresponds to the situation where human receive 10 unit from entering heaven, but then minus 1 and equals to 9 because here is the energy spent on worshiping God. And also here you could see that if God decided to punish a believer, then God would have a -5 utility because God prefers not to punish human. God is merciful and God does not really like to punish anyone. Okay, so you see the logic of the payoff setup in this model. And you could follow the same logic and check for each of these boxes, but then I'm not going to do that right here. Now I'm moving on to actually analyzing this game. So let us first consider what actions would God take if God actually exists. So we can first see that suppose human being decided they wanted to be a believer. What is the best response for God? And so the best response would be to don't punish, since God will receive a payoff of 5 as opposed to payoff of -5. And suppose human being would like to be an atheist. What is the best response for God? Well, it's still the same. It's still do not punish, since -1 is still better than -2. So here we essentially see that there's a dominant strategy in the sense that God would never like to punish people, since it always, regardless of the action of human beings, God would always receive a greater payoff by playing do not punish. And now we look at the case of when God does not exist. So we see here that the payoff are all 0 for God, irrespective of what choices does God make. This means that God is actually indifferent between choosing punish or do not punish. And in terms of the logic behind this, it is fairly comprehensible, since if God does not exist, then you can't actually punish any human beings. So if God does not exist, then you essentially just have don't punish, since it won't change anything. And now let us consider from the perspective of human beings. So suppose God do exist, then what would be the best response for human being? Well, if God does exist, then human being will want to be a believer, since you're going to receive a payoff of 9 rather than the payoff of 0. And for the case of God does not exist, human being would actually prefer to be an atheist, because here you're receiving payoff of 0, 0, as opposed to the possible negative payoff, -1, -1. And we call that this -1 would represent the energy spent on worshiping God. So it's 1 unit of this energy spent. All right. So this would be uh, the summary of this game structure. And now we're going to look at the expected utility that could be gained from playing this game. So here we're looking at the expected utility for player I when choosing a specific strategy space, given that a specific type is being played. Type. And so this formula is break up into different parts. So here we're looking at the utility that can be received by playing specific action in a specific type space. Here we're looking at the probability of occurrence of any given specific types. And here we're essentially looking at what is the probability of each action's occurrence within a type. And then these actions they sum together and they have this strategy space. And so taken together, it would be the interim expected utility of any given player within a Bayesian games. Now, having this knowledge, we're trying to actually solve for the Bayesian equilibrium in this game. And let me just mark this up really quickly, since we already established that this option would never be played. Okay, so recall that during equilibrium, both players they should be best responding to each of others' actions, and so they do not have any incentive to deviate from their current actions. So with that in mind, we're trying to see that in what scenario would human beings actually be indifferent between choosing a believer and being an atheist? Well, if you think about it, then it would be the case that the expected utility of being a believer would equal to the expected utility of being an atheist, right? Since if what you're gaining is equal on both sides, then you don't really have any reason to prefer being one over the other. So this is exactly what we're trying to solve here. And let us first compute the utility of being a believer. It would be that you're receiving 9 units with a probability P that this game is actually being played, and then plus utility of -1 times 1 minus P of this probability that does not exist game is being played. This would be set equal to, well, the utility received by being an atheist is always 0. So I'm simply just going to put down 0 here. And then, well, we'll just do some arithmetic and then solve for p. So we get that 10 p equals to 1. P would be 1/10. Okay, so we're almost there. We have established that during equilibrium, the probability would equals to 1/10, which would be as the following. So with this specific value of probability, human player is actually indifferent between the choices of believer and atheist. Okay, so let us consider the full picture of a Bayesian Nash equilibrium. In the case that God does exist, then the dominant strategy is to not punish, and we have already established this at the very beginning. If God does not exist, then God is indifferent between playing both of punish or not punish, since their payoff is always 0. And for p greater than 1/10, human would prefer to be a believer. So interpreting from this game matrix, we're seeing that if the probability that God exists is greater than this value, then we will want to be a believer, since we're going to receive more utility by doing this strategy. And for p less than 1/10, human would prefer to be an atheist. For situation of p exactly equals to 1/10, human is indifferent between being believer or an atheist. And so these bullet points, they together captures the image of a Bayesian Nash equilibrium. And so in conclusion, if what you believe if you believe that God actually exists with a probability of greater than just 10% or 1/10, then you should actually believe in God, since this will maximize the utility for yourself.